So you decided to make some sourdough bread because it's kind of the cool thing to do right now. And you had visions of these crusty, amazing loaves, but it didn't quite turn out like you thought, did it? Well, take heart, my friend, because I have some tips for you today that will turn your sourdough situation around once and for all. I'm Jill Winger, founder of theprairiehomestead.com, and I help modern folks learn old-fashioned skills that make life healthier and happier. So if you're wanting to know just how to start a sourdough starter in general, or how to make a basic loaf of amazing sourdough bread, I have 2 other videos on those very topics, and I will link them in the show notes. However, today is all about the troubleshooting. So I'm getting a lot of emails right now about sourdough, and there's 2 main issues that are coming up. First off, people are confused as to whether or not their sourdough starter is behaving properly. And then the second thing is that they're trying to make some bread recipes and they're just not working out. So let's talk about the starter first. So I define an active, healthy starter as a starter that will rise with lots of bubbles and technically double in size 3 to 4 hours after you feed it. There's also another really easy test you can perform called the float test that'll give you a really good idea if your starter is ready to roll. It's super simple. All you need to do is take your starter that you have fed within the last couple of hours and a cup of water. And we're just gonna take about a teaspoon of the starter and place it in the cup of water. If it sinks to the bottom, it's a no-go. But if it floats to the top, odds are you'll be able to use it as yeast in your next bread recipe. Okay, so if your starter isn't working out like you want it to, the first thing you can try to change, it's really easy, is just use different flour. So with sourdough starter, we're capturing wild yeast, and a lot of that yeast resides on the flour we're using. So maybe you're using old flour, stale flour, bleached flour, and you don't even know it. So try a different brand or a different variety to see if that will help. A lot of the time I feed my starter just your typical unbleached, all-purpose organic flour. Now, since we are kind of rationing our all-purpose flour at the moment, I am feeding whole wheat flour instead because I have a lot of it in my basement. Well, I have it in whole form in the basement. I have been grinding up these wheat berries and using that flour to feed my starter. So that's absolutely an option. And a lot of times the starters love that extra goodness in the whole wheat. Okay, so the next thing you can try switching out is the water. Check out my dirty dishes. Now, obviously water isn't too complicated, but if you live in town and you have chlorinated water, that could be causing some issues. Thankfully, there's an easy workaround for this. All you gotta do is take a bowl or a cup, fill it up from your tap, and then just leave it out on your counter overnight. Now, the good thing about chlorine, and there isn't a lot of good things because I'm not a fan, but the good thing about it is that it evaporates easily, and then you can use that water to feed your starter that very next day. And then another easy thing to try is to try putting your starter in a warmer location. So I like to put mine over here by the stove. If that doesn't work for you, you can try putting it up on top of your refrigerator, or if none of those options work, try putting it in your oven with the oven off, but the light on. Now, the only downfall to this trick is that it's really easy to forget it's in there, and then you preheat the oven and burn your starter to death. Don't do that. So put a giant sticky note on the oven so you don't make that mistake. And lastly, another issue is that maybe you're not feeding it enough. So in my cookbook and in my Heritage Cooking Crash Course, we talk about feeding a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So that means for the weight of the sourdough starter itself, not including the weight of the jar, we want to feed it equal amounts in weight of flour and water. And if you're skimping on that a little bit, you might not be killing your starter, but it might not be active or energized enough to really do well in your bread recipe. So I'm gonna use a scale today. I don't always use a scale, but if you're wondering if you're not getting your ratios right, it's really helpful. So first things first, I need to find out the weight of my sourdough starter. Now there's a couple ways I could do this. I could weigh an empty jar and then weigh the full jar and then do some subtraction, or I can just put the starter into a bowl and go from there. All right, so I have my scale on. I'm going to zero out the weight of the bowl. And I'm gonna use grams for today's measurement. You can use ounces, use whatever, doesn't matter. Grams are what most sourdough people use. So I'm just gonna pour out the starter into the bowl. Holy moly, I'm making a mess. Can you see this? I cannot do a cooking video without making a disaster of my kitchen. So I have, I don't know if you can see this, just over 400 grams of starter. That's a lot of starter. So if I feed this 400 grams of flour and 400 grams of water, I'm gonna need a way bigger jar than I have right now. Therefore, I'm gonna discard a little more than half of this before I feed it. And that'll reduce the amount of flour I have to use and also prevent me from using a swimming pool to contain my sourdough starter. That leaves me with about 190 grams of starter. Now, for all of you number folks, I don't want you to get hung up with the exact perfect numbers. Like, if you can have a ballpark of how much starter you want to leave in your jar every day, I'm really just winging it here. Don't freak out about the discard, because this isn't wasteful, because we're going to use this in other recipes. You can save this up till you have enough to make pancakes or waffles or the sourdough brownies or crackers that are in my cookbook. Or, for example, like I made a sourdough coffee cake, and it didn't matter that the starter wasn't super bubbly because I used baking soda as the leavening agent in that coffee cake recipe. So it worked out great. Now, keep in mind, I don't always, hardly ever actually, put it into a bowl like this and weigh it. Most of the time I'm eyeballing it. But as you're learning and your eyeballs aren't quite calibrated yet, there's no shame in using a scale. Okay, so I just measured out 200 grams of flour, and I use mostly whole wheat flour because that's just what I'm feeding right now. I'm gonna add that in. And now I'm just measuring out 200 grams of water, lukewarm. Oop, maybe too much. And I just like my starter to be about the consistency of a thick pancake batter. You see that? Okay, I'm just gonna scrape down the sides of the jar, and we're good. So really, I can't think of any other reason your starter wouldn't be getting some action going if you do the things that we just mentioned in this video. So you have an active starter, but you're still having issues with the bread. There's a couple things that might be coming into play here. First off, I cannot stress this enough. Make sure you give your starter enough time to mature before you try to use it in bread. This is the tough part of sourdough. This is the part that requires the patience. You can't have your starter on the counter for 4 days and then expect it to rise up a beautiful loaf of bread. It needs more time. I would say to wait at least 3 weeks before you try to use your starter in a recipe that needs that yeast action. Now, that's not to say you can't use it in other recipes before then. You can use it in the quick breads or the brownies or the crackers or the pancakes or anything that has other leavening agents like baking soda or baking powder, but don't expect it to go crazy on the yeast action when it's still a baby. Sorry, I got a puppy requesting to come in. Why are you barking? Another issue I see beginning sourdough bakers having issues with is they don't give their loaves enough time to rise. I would say that my sourdough bread rises for about 12 hours total before I put it in the oven. And that scares some people off, but that's actually the beauty of this slow food. That's what gives the sourdough time to ferment and break down the flour and make it healthier for you and more digestible. So we gotta give it time to do that. But I would say 99% of the time people are under rising, not over rising. And don't forget to let your dough rise in a super warm spot.